Hello, my name is Nasser. I am presenting this presentation on behalf of our team, which is multidisciplinary teams of people who work in computer science, art, humanities, and astrophysics. We come from different institutions across Europe, UK, and Philippines, and we are all part of the Art Science Collaborative called SEEDS. Um, so the information in this presentation comes from two different sources. Attempts to conduct systematic reviews. We were looking at two systematic reviews in two different fields, in art science and astrophysics, which is very different fields and very different from health. And we run a 2 hours experimental performative session that I taught systematic reviews to people, to the group, which were people who have no connection to health and coming from very different fields, and trying to get them to work through different steps of it. So the first issue, like in a systematic review, and that we try to address and look at into a structure of the research question. Um, and so in this, the astrophysics project, I selected a research question based on a master dissertation I'm working on. And it felt like very simple, but as I started the review, I found out that it's actually quite complicated because of this question from an epidemiology point of view, it sounds very simple because it's a correlation. How the studies in astrophysics are structured are quite different. They usually are. The question comes from a model, and there's this like the model defines why they do certain data collection and correlation of it. So I have all of these different pieces of data that are part of studies that have different models, and that's all of the design behind them is around that model that has been chosen there. For the art science collaboration project, I, a lot of the people who were involved, um, we tried to talk about how the different ways of structuring such question, like PICO, PECO, or the other ones we usually use. And as you can see, people came up with different questions. Some of them, they were attempts to structure them like a structured healthcare research question. Um, and and that's actually was interesting because in the first look, it sounds a very good idea to use a structured question we use in that we already have, like Pico for it. And people tend to do that when they want to try to do systems reviews. It doesn't do that well when you're trying to do the rest of the systems review if in that discipline that structure is not a recognized way of structuring research question. Which brings me to the question that probably we need um, more meta research studies of how research questions are structured in the field before we start imposing our structures in them. Um, and yeah, and um, and one of the other things that came up, especially with the astrophysics one, was that about how much the narrative and the model used to describe uh, the behind explaining the data is shaping what the research question ask and how they're analyzed afterwards. Uh, so unexpectedly, I realized that actually, in some ways, I have to think about them as much as quantitatively analyzing data, but also thinking about like as a meta narrative when I'm doing astrophysics reviews, which wasn't what I was expecting to do. Building a sales strategy, I have to say, when we did the performative session, one of the parts that people appreciated the most, got really excited about learning about how databases work and how much other tools you have to do searching in them. And that is interesting because these databases have not only existed for healthcare, a lot of them can be used in other fields, and but the training about access to information specialists and training of such skills needs a lot of improvement in still. Um, so and one of the other things is that often comparably people know a lot about databases in their field, but there's still important databases that can be relevant that not everybody knows about it. And also some of the specialist databases in certain fields are not, they don't have well designed search interfaces, which makes it difficult. And besides the medical literature, most other disciplines, the tagging system is not as comprehensive as advanced as it is medical healthcare, And also in these two fields, I didn't have another solution, but I know that in environmental evidence, they have came up with like coding programs trying to produce a similar mechanism for automation for the similar to the mesh system we use in medicine. So screening of studies, this was an interesting one because if you if you're only involved in systematic or RCTs, screening part, you have a PICO, you make inclusion exclusion criteria and follow it. It's not very difficult to get a replicable strategy to screen studies. You might do a pilot, you might do some kappa studies. But when I did the smart reviews with Camarades, the animal and then in vitro studies, I realized how much work we had to do, how much piloting and testing we had to do to come up with a way to approach the screening of the studies to be replicable. And it also came up here that uh, understanding how to approach it, what people see in a study in abstract, included, excluded, the thing is related. It takes a lot of work and practice and very kind of clear criteria. So if people want to run systematic reviews like this, is in this field, I would say that you need a few rounds of piloting of how to do screening before you come up with a replicable strategy that all of the reviewers can follow. However, even if you never do a systematic review, you develop an eye about how to identify screen studies just to practicing it. Um, I kind of realized that after I started to try to do the systematic review for my master in astrophysics, but reading the rest of the text literature in the field was much easier for me because I started to kind of build an eye on what is it and what type of studies, how they report and structure it. One of the biggest problem I think is as much as enough other fields is that um, one of the major things we want to address in systematic reviews is to manage or minimize bias across studies. And we only can do that if we know what the meta biases or the bias in the individual studies are. First of all, we don't know what the meta biases are in other discipline. Does publication bias work the same way or not? An example here is actually I can give from another field, totally different one, and it's a presentation here in this conference which Audrey Tan talks about systematic an overview of reviews of research rights setting. And one of the things we're suggesting there, of it's not based on a meta research study, it's more based on our experience on the literature, is that our expectation is that the what the meta bias works in research bias setting is that people tend to publish research pattern exercises that have some new methodologies or have some complexity to it, like has quantitative aspect. If it's just normal consensus, they don't publish it, it becomes a rare literature. So there, the publication bias is based on the complexity of the methodology rather than whether the results positive or negative. I don't know what the meta biases are in astrophysics or in art and science collaboration. We would expect that some of the similarities exist in there, like healthcare, but we don't have meta studies supporting it. And again, structured replicable as critical appraisal tools is not a common practice, not a discipline. Um, I have to say, I do have expected in a quantitative one like astrophysics it would be there, but it wasn't. And I had long debates about how selection bias works in individual studies, which is a very important, and there are lots of concepts there, but there is no like a standard tool I can use to to use for all of the studies. Um, yeah, the synthesis one, as I mentioned before, is the issue about how much of the data is. So, because if you remember, the question I had was a correlation of inclination of spiral galaxies and H alpha lines, which is the line you see on the spectrograph. But um, most of the studies would not be structured like a correlation of two data. The structure, the research studies in astrophysics are more aligned like they use a model for the galaxies and then try to collect data based on that. And the observation of the data is usually by pre-collected data from telescopes because it's very expensive to collect them. And then the question comes up how much those all of those decisions, which is based on that model, is influencing or introducing bias. I'd like to call it as that what's the narrative or story behind the data, because in some ways it looks to me more like there are different storylines and plus the data has been analyzed. With the art science one, I think what it came up with a different question is that, and this is from David Goff and Sandy Oliver's book about systematic reviews, about aggregative and configurative reviews, and some of the frustration because we had also one of the people, Zainab, in our group. She tried to do systematic reviews before, like that before we met, and she knew I knew what about systematic reviews. And I think, and she had a lot of attempts of screening, which ended up in frustration. And we went looking back on some of them. I think the issue is a lot of them is to how do you screen differently or approach it differently if it's an aggregative question review or the configurative one. And if you don't have not read Sandy's book and use the like Google the standard systematic review methodology, configurative reviews is not something that comes up, but actually it's quite important in certain fields like humanities in shaping their work. So one of the things I did to bring all of this together, we made this chart on um, knowledge exchange around systematic review and systematic review. One reason I call it knowledge exchange is to I think it would be very arrogant to say that we in health we know better than anybody else. It's kind of being open how they know what they know we can learn is also important. And I think there is connection between structuring data and literature and running systematic reviews that might be useful to think about. So yeah, a stage zero is how do people do literature review in the field? Would they benefit of an exchange? What can we learn from them? I think before people start doing systematic review in the field, it will be useful to actually spend some time introducing people with the concept before jumping into do systematic reviews. Like when we did this performative 2 hours systematic review training, is that I could see that a lot of people getting familiar with the concept and some of the concepts are really interesting for them, but that would be more useful in taking time to explore them before trying to force certain systematic review methodology would be useful because it would help them to identify where the methods adaptation needs, what are meta research studies that need to be conducted before, what are the skills we need to develop first before we conduct it. And I think one of the most primary skills that everybody needs is more better training set skills and access to information specialists. However, if people start to doing systematic reviews, it would be very useful that to have not only to monitor how the methodology evolves and continue to run meta research studies, but it would be also useful, like in healthcare, we do, as you all know, we do reporting guidelines, which is our way of helping to structure the methodology of the studies to help us to do systematic reviews or introduce registries. Um, Reporting guideline might be something for other fields, but might be not. So the question would be, what are the different ways um, the field can structure the data better using systematic reviews? Yeah, that was the presentation. Thank you very much for listening and happy to answer any questions.